Welcome back to Sign, Pointing People to Jesus. This is our third and last session, and we've covered a lot of ground so far. We've looked at how to share the big story. We've looked at how to share your own story and to build bridges to connect people to the gospel. And in this session, what we're looking at is being a sign writer. How to get the message out. What's your personal plan for sharing the good news and pointing people to Jesus? Did you know that well-written signs always get read? If you want to get a sign out there, if you want to get a message out there, then you need to be intentional. You've got to work out, who am I trying to reach? How will they receive this? How can I make people stop and actually take notice of this so that the message is effective, so the sign actually points where it's supposed to go? And I don't think there's a better sign writer than God. Look at the kind of signs that he does. He's got like the rainbow as a sign that he's never again going to flood the world. He's got the tabernacle. He's got the Passover. There's all these kind of amazing signs that he uses to get us to sit up and pay attention. And then Jesus follows suit. Water into wine. That's not a bad miracle. He has a mountaintop transfiguration. And his piece de resistance is a sign of Jonah, resurrection, coming back from the dead. But maybe you're thinking, I can't really do those kind of signs. I mean, how can I make a signpost that's effective that people actually pay attention to? You may especially be feeling like, I'm weak, I'm unskilled. How do I reach out to people like this when I'm not even feeling confident in myself? And I can identify with that. But what I want to say is that God uses everyone. And you know, perhaps his best work is reserved for those who do feel weak and feel unskilled and unable. That's because when God chooses to write a sign through us in our weakness, what it does is it points to how great he is. And people stop and say, this sign could only come from the hand of God because you couldn't turn it on. And so when I start to feel down like that, I tell you one story that I love is the story of Arthur Stace. Because if God could use a guy like Arthur, then he can definitely use me and he can definitely use you. Arthur guy? Well, to put it in simplest terms, Arthur was a loser. I know it sounds harsh, but it's pretty hard to describe someone who has whittled away 40 years of their life. Arthur was born back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, around that time in Sydney. And he was born to alcoholic parents, and he definitely followed in their footsteps. By the age of 15, Arthur was a ward of the state. He was on his way to prison. Arthur's life didn't turn out probably the way he would have liked. And by the age of 20, he was being the watchman for his sister's brothel, letting her know if the police were on their way. So at the age of 46, Arthur, an alcoholic, wanders into this church and he hears this random preacher prattle on about eternity. Eternity, eternity. One day you're going to meet it. Where are you going to be? And Arthur didn't even know why, but his heart was just gripped as he heard this story. And right then and there, he gave his heart to the Lord. Now, he didn't even know what he committed himself to, but it turns out that just as Arthur made a commitment to God, God had decided to commit Arthur to being a sign writer. So Arthur left that place, and eternity kept running on through his head. And so Arthur just had to write it. He had to get this out. And so he grabbed some chalk, and he wrote the word eternity. Now, Arthur was essentially illiterate. He could hardly write his own name. But Arthur says when he started to write the word eternity, he doesn't know how it happened, but it came out in beautiful copperplate script. And so Arthur then would start to go out and write the word eternity anywhere he could. Bus shelters. He'd write it on the streets. He'd write it above, hovels. Anywhere he could, he would write the word eternity, never knowing what kind of impact that this would have. So for 35 years, Arthur got up pretty much every morning at 5 a.m. because he didn't want to draw attention. He was still a simple guy, largely living on the streets. He would get up, he would pound the pavements of Sydney and write the word eternity. They reckon he did it probably 500,000 times. That's all Arthur had to offer. And you might think, what kind of effect did this have? Well, if it wasn't for a journalist who one day finally solved the mystery of Mr. Eternity, as he came to be known, we wouldn't know anything of Arthur's story. You see, Arthur was found out by some people, but people were asking, what's this eternity thing? Who's writing this? It even made the newspapers. And so they did an article on this guy when they tracked him down. He didn't want the attention. And it's only after the fact that a lot of people said, that literally hundreds of people said, it was through seeing that word eternity that something just started to work in me, and I searched out, what is eternity? Where am I going? And literally hundreds of people testified that it was Arthur's sign writing that was the beginning of their journey to come and know God. Now you might think, what's the big deal? Some guy writing signs. I tell you what, here's the kind of effect this has had. If you go to the National Gallery in Canberra, you'll find that they've set up an eternity gallery where they've got one of the signs that Arthur originally wrote, and they've mounted it there, and they've put an eternity gallery where all kinds of everyday Australians share their not-so-ordinary stories. There's been an opera made about this guy's life. I saw a TV show on it. But probably the highlight of this was in the 2000 the Olympics, and they put up on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. They lit it up for the turn of the millennia, and it said eternity, exactly as Arthur would have written it. I mean, can you picture this? This simple guy with so little to offer, and God wrote amazing signs through him that everyone stopped and paid attention to. Can God use you? Absolutely. God can use anyone, and He delights in using those who have got the greatest struggles, those who feel the least equipped. The whole point of the sign series has been equipping you guys so that you can get outside of the church building to put up a sign where it's most needed, by those who don't know the way to life, by those who desperately need God. Now, you've got a clear signpost, and you've worked on your sign language so that you know how to make sense of this message. And this session is focused so that you can be an intentional sign writer, so that you can make sure you're reaching out to people, that you've got a way forward, that you've got a personal plan so that you know 5 people that you're trying to reach, and you know how to reach out to them, how to serve them, how to listen to them, and how to share your story with them. And that's the aim, that's the big win by the end of this session, is that you will have a plan fully written out to know where you're going with this, to commit it to God, and to see the fruit that comes from being an intentional sign writer.